Sorry about that. Jeremy?
All right, so tonight we have ARM Consulting here. As I don't know if everybody remembers, we had the release plan that we had to send into the state aid. I just wanted to read a quick paragraph that was in there. The Derry Cooperative School District will contract with an independent roofing consultant to perform annual inspections on all roofs and report findings with recommendations for repairs. These repairs should be completed as quickly as possible, either by in-house staff or with the help of professional roofing contractors. All requests for repairs should be logged into a computerized work order. Maintenance systems provide a history of issues and completed repairs. The consultant will work with the director of facilities to develop and update a current and ongoing plan for roof refurbishment and/or replacement. This information will be used to justify requests for funding. So, with that, we reached out to Tim Archer from ARM Consultants. We met with him, kind of went over what we were looking for, and they started to do a roof assessment. The old roof assessment that went in with the state application was from a few years ago. So we kind of wanted to do an update and see where the roofs are at, years later, and kind of just see where we're sitting with that. They've gone and they've started the assessment. It's pretty close to being done with the report, which will end up being to send to Amy Clark, right? That will be for maybe a couple of weeks, but I'll let them speak to that. So I guess if you guys could come up and just tell us a little bit about yourselves and where you're at and kind of maybe what you found so far with the roofs.
And Tim, we'll just, when you're done your introduction, we'll follow along with the PowerPoint of which school if you wanted to talk to. If you wanted to talk to each school and what the, because the board all has this, and then the smaller, just the photo will be up on the screen.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you.
So, I'm Tim Archer. I'm the owner of ARM Consultants. We're a roof consulting company, so all we do is look at roofs every day, all day, probably a little bit longer every day than we probably should. So last year we looked at about 23 million square feet of roof. We do asset management for large companies that include like Harvard Medical School, Yale, and UNH, for example. So we're really adept at looking at all the different aspects of roof and trying to extend serviceable life. And then when it comes time for replacement, representing the owners and doing the design for them. So that way, as the roofs get replaced, you're getting what you're paying for. So that's a huge thing for especially a town like this. I'm local to this area. I live in Chester. So my wife actually grew up in Derry, so she went to a lot of these schools. We both graduated Pinkerton, so we definitely understand kind of the dynamic of this town and what goes on here. So that's a little bit of background on me. Brian?
My name is Brian Toner. I work for Tim, a project manager and CAD drafter. I have about 5 years experience with roofing, office work, CAD work, design, FM Global, all sorts of insurances. Pretty much summed it up. My wife also went to Pinkerton, graduated. She grew up in Hampstead. Yeah, pretty much it.
So this type of planning is something that we've done for a lot of different towns, a lot of different communities, so it's something that we're pretty comfortable handling. If we want to start going through some of these, please understand that there's a lot of information on here, and it looks pretty bad, but not everything is as horrible as you might think it is. You guys happen to have a lot of the different food groups, as we'll call them, for roofing. You have different types of membranes, you have shingles, metal roofing, so you have a lot of different things, a lot of different materials. So having an idea as to how all that stuff works and can work together is a big part of some of the observations that we have here. So with that, something like the Ernest Barker School, there's a lot here, there's a lot of red, which means that there needs to be some attention taken to those areas, but it could be a simple repair, it could just be debris on the roof. There's a lot of things that go into this that might not be an immediate need, and that's what the report is going to break down a little bit more for you, so that way you guys can see where your immediate needs are, where your future needs are, and be able to kind of plan out the rest of the process. So the Ernest Parker School is a TPO roof. It's probably your newest building, if I'm not mistaken. You're having some issues with some of the membranes and some of the flashings that are there, but it's not something that's insurmountable. So if we can kind of get some funding in the nearer future to start taking care of some of these problems, we can stabilize some of these roofs to fend off having full replacements for a few years, 4 years, 5 years, depending on the building. So in order to stabilize these things, the funding that we're going to need is going to be able to save some of the insulation that's there, which is a huge cost. So the more that we can stabilize things now and prevent water from getting into the system, the easier it's going to be to budget in the future. So that's kind of the goal of all of these, not just for the Parker School, but for all of them, is to get them to a point where we stop taking in water. So that's kind of the long and short of what we have so far. It'll probably be another 2 weeks or so before we can get the final report with everything in it. And then we can go through a lot more detail as to what the funding would be, what we're looking at for immediate needs, and what we're looking at for more long-term, if that makes sense to everybody.
In case you're looking at these sheets, the name of the location's on the sidebar of the box here.
So the pictures that you're looking at up here are a little bit bigger, so that's why we printed them twice. All of the writing in the legends are, that's what we on there, right?
No, we just put the photo of the actual photo up on the screen since there was too much information.
So I guess I don't know if you guys want them to go through each and every building, or you kind of get the gist of what they're doing and where they're at so far with Barker, until we have the full report.
We can get into as much detail as you would like right now. We just don't have the final report. So we can get into what the decking types are, what the different membranes are, what the insulation values are. Like, we have all that info if you want to get into it, but I'm guessing we don't have the time or want probably to get into all the weeds.
Are there any basic points that you would make about Derry Village and South Range? Without getting too in-depth?
Yeah. So Derry Village and South Range are the two schools that are in the worst condition currently. They have a few challenges if you were to desire to re-roof them. They have kind of mongrel deck types. The decking that's on there for the structure for the Derry Village School is something that's called gypsum, which most of you would know as drywall. So if that gets wet, obviously it degrades. So the more water that you're taking into there, the more structurally unstable the roof deck is becoming. So that's a real concern. You have crack splits and other aspects. It doesn't drain correctly. You're holding a lot of water on the roof.
Open field seams.
You have open field seams. So the good part about holding water on the roof is you know it's not leaking right there. The bad part about holding water on the roof is you can be overwhelming the structure. You can only hold so much water before you start having a load that's too high. So that particular school is difficult, let's say, and it needs a fair amount of attention fairly quickly. Like I said, the decking there, the wetter it gets, the longer it sits, the worse it's going to be. So
Range is the same way?
South Range is a slightly different deck. It's something called tectum. It looks like
Ramen noodles.
yeah, ramen noodles. So it's basically cementitious wood fiber. So it's strands of wood that are kind of glued together with cement. And that has a similar problem where if it gets wet, it expands the wood, and then you start degrading the concrete that's around it, holding it together. So now it, again, becomes a structural issue. It looks like they were built fairly close to the same time frame because they're kind of like twin schools. both are having similar issues. It just is a slightly different type of decking. Neither type of decking is used anymore, really, and getting it repaired with the same materials is getting more and more difficult and more expensive. So they're all aspects that you need to take into consideration looking at these buildings specifically, because you are running into a problem where you're starting to degrade the decking, because we can see that it's taking in water in multiple locations.
So when you talk about both South Range and Derry Village and the immediate need to do that, what is your timeline on when that should be
What
done?
immediate it really means?
Yeah,
As funding allows, I guess, is the nicest way to put it. So if you're able to raise the funding for those buildings, I would recommend that you get them done quickly. And if not, you need to at least stabilize and prevent more water from coming in.
A lot of the areas that have ponding water also had slow leaks going in that ponding water location. So we
What we had available at the time.
So you mentioned that South Range and Derry Village are kind of the two that have the biggest needs, I hear you saying.
Very much so.
How, could you tell us how that list goes down in order after that, kind of by school?
Sure. So Derry Village and South Range, and then
I would say
Again, the
East
report's
Derry
not done, just so you know.
probably in the best shape.
I do know that.
East End is
Okay.
the best shape.
Yeah. Out of all of them.
Why don't you look at this?
Yep. Okay, so, yeah, so I would say, and just as I go through these, East Derry Elementary is probably in the best shape. I believe that's still under warranty for a couple of years, but it's a material-only warranty. I think there is a workmanship, one-year workmanship warranty that we were able to find through the manufacturer.
Which is expired, correct?
I believe there's, it expires this month, if it hasn't already
Okay.
expired.
So,
So the Hood Middle School is in fairly decent condition. I would say that's probably next in line. The shingles are older, 3-tab shingles. They have some staining on them, some exposed felts, but that's, that's something that can be taken care of a little further down the line. Hood had, sorry, was that me? Hood had some areas where it had accelerated UV degradation, some of the same thing that we saw actually over at here. Yeah, so it's, without getting into too much detail, the TPO membrane is starting to wear away to the point where it's almost, it either has holes in it or it's at the end of its life.
So previously, whoever was dealing with the roof situations was using a TPO membrane, which is the least expensive membrane that you can buy, and there are some drawbacks to it long-term, and we're seeing some of those drawbacks now. So that membrane specifically, when it gets warm or overheated with sun and reflections off of glass or rising walls, tends to overheat it and actually eat away at the membrane. So it's something that
Closer to you, so they can picture it without having to
Okay.
turn it up so loud.
So it's been eating away at the membrane for long enough that you can actually see through the membrane in some locations. If you put your hand under the membrane, you can see your hand. So it's a problem.
That was Hood Middle School and here. Yep.
Yep, Hood, and also it's happening here. Not quite as bad here, but it is starting to happen.
Right. Grinnell Elementary, same type of deal where the shingles are in fairly okay shape. They're older 3-tab shingles, starting to wear. They have exposed felts throughout. You've seen a lot of repairs up there. It is an older ballasted roof. A lot of the flashings are starting to deteriorate. The membrane underneath the ballast, because it hasn't been as exposed to the UV rays, is still in decent shape. There's a couple newer sections, a newer fully adhered EPDM roof and newer shingle section that was replaced within the last I don't know, I would say 5 or so years. So Grinnell's not in too bad a shape.
And then West Running Brook.
Yep, and then this one, same type of deal. The metal roofing has had a lot of repairs, and then there's like a snow shelf roof that a lot of the seams are now opening and becoming exposed. I'm guessing because the snow had sat there and kind of deteriorated all the flashings. Metal roofing is in pretty decent shape, but the ballast roof is starting to wear at all the flashings.
So basically, the stuff that's been exposed to the sun for a long period of time, since these are older roofs, you're starting to have some dry rot and some other problems that are going to need to be taken care of in order to get them back to a salvageable condition.
Yes.
We're hoping that there hasn't been that much water infiltration in some of these areas, but if we continue to kick the can down the road, it's just going to get worse and worse. Roofs don't get better unless they have attention.
Do you, are there any roofs, do they all need replaced, or are there some that just need some repairs?
So the vast majority of them look like you can get away with repairs for a while, varying degrees, but you should be able to get away with some repairs to extend the serviceable life that you have. But I don't think any of them are going to last you more than 10 years. We have to go through a couple more revisions of this, so I'm giving that a little bit more leeway than I probably should, but I don't think any of these roofs are going to last more than 10 years. Based on, well, maybe the metal ones, but outside of that, the membrane roofs will not last that long.
And in a lot of cases, it would probably be closer to like 1 to 3, and then with proper maintenance, it would extend 4 to 7,
Right.
no further than 10.
If you leave them the way that they are currently and don't do the repairs, you're going to shorten that life considerably to 1 to 3 years. Once water starts getting into the assemblies, your insulation will start to break down. Most insulations have a paper facer on them, so it's just like regular drywall at your house. If it gets wet, it tends to grow mold. So we can't let that happen, because then it costs exponentially more to fix, and then you have indoor air quality issues. There's a lot more that can go wrong.
Knowing we have multiple different roof styles and materials and everything, on your final report as part of that, will you have kind of a priority list of, if you do this now, it'll be cheaper, this you have to do now, or, this one isn't as bad, but it's going to cost more if you wait, type of thing?
So we typically rate them on like a 1 to 5 scale. 1 is good, 2 is fair, 3 is damaged, and it kind of goes up. And as far as notify customer, like you're taking on water right now, we need to get out there today. So that will all be broken down, as well as future replacement estimates, like how long this roof will last. This takes priority here. So it will be broken down on a 1 to 5, so 1 to 6 scale.
And it also will have what the anticipated replacement costs are in today's dollars. But if anybody here is in the construction industry, today's dollars don't mean much next week at this point. So we can give you estimated construction costs for if we can save the insulation as a recover versus if we have to do a full replacement, and kind of how long it'll take to get to those points. So I don't know if that 100% answers your question.
It does. No, like you mentioned, if we can save insulation by doing a replacement now or doing repairs now, I think that tells us kind of like, oh yeah, that makes sense, because the insulation costs would just make things more expensive down the road. So.
Right. If you can replace a roof 1 year early before you have a major failure and save the insulation, it's going to save you probably about 35 to 40% of the cost of the roof.
Okay.
So it's very important to try to save that as much as we can.
All right. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Thank you, Jeremy. So when you guys say they're not going to last more than 10 years, so if we do like the stabilization or we do some repairs now, are you saying that we do one time and then we could expect 10 more years out of life out of these roofs? Or is this, hey, we're investing money now, and then in 3 to 5 years we got to invest some more money to continue with the repairs and things like that? Like, can you describe that
Yep.
kind of thought process?
As I said before, roofs that don't get attention don't get better, so you're going to have to pay attention to these things in order to keep them in a salvageable condition. It would be great if nobody ever went up on these roofs and nobody ever dropped any screwdrivers or anything like that, but it's going to happen. Caulking dries out. Caulking only lasts 3 to 5 years, and that is an integral part of waterproofing on a roof, unfortunately. So it's something that you're going to have to maintain. So you'll have a larger initial investment for the repairs that we have, because we haven't been keeping up with this from what it looks like to us, just walking around on the roofs. So it's going to be a larger initial investment, and then the years following, it will be something that's a little bit more manageable, and we can actually work with you on, this is what we anticipate this particular building needing 2 years, 3 years, 4 years down the road in order to keep it in a good condition. But it's not something that you can just set and forget. You have to keep up with it.
But even so, some of the roofs that, I guess part of his question would be like, are we putting money at it just to get us that extra few years, and it needs to be replaced?
Yes.
I mean,
So-
the roof, if it's a 20-year roof, we're going on 32 years.
Yep.
We just want to get by so that we can do planning, but it's going to cost money. It doesn't mean that if we put $100,000 into a roof, that we're going to get 15 years out of it. It just means that
No, so what part of the report will be...
prolonging the inevitable.
Right, so part of the report would be, Derry Village School. You can throw a fair amount of money at it because there's a lot of problems there, but it's still only going to buy you so much time. So we
Right.
will try to show you where you're going to spend your money so that way it will
Right.
last longer, go further, versus you can spend this money and it's really just a Band-Aid when you need a tourniquet. So we will show you that as well. Because it doesn't make sense necessarily to repair things unless you're trying to just stabilize so you're not getting water in the building, versus replacing it because it's so far past its useful life that you kind of have to replace it.
Are there any roofs in the district that are still within their serviceable life? If we have a 20-year roof, are we still within that?
I think East Derry
East
is,
Derry.
And that was the one that's pretty much ending soon, I guess?
you have 1 month left on the
Okay.
warranty. It's a warranty, so
Yeah.
warranties are warranties, like anything else. Your refrigerator could be out of warranty,
Yeah.
but it still keeps running. So as long as you're maintaining these, EPDM roofs specifically should be able to last about 30 years, 35 years, as long as you're maintaining them. So you can last 42, like, there's been all sorts of studies done. You can keep a roof 42% longer if you just maintain it.
Okay.
Going up every year, doing your maintenance, making sure the caulkings aren't failing,
Cleaning the drains.
cleaning drains, keeping debris off of them. Minor stuff, short dollars in the short term, but it makes a big difference long term. So if we're starting from here, we can start setting up plans like that, so that way the district does have longevity out of their roofs. It just hasn't been done to this point.
So it seems like I'm hearing that some of the roofs are newer, I guess, 20 years old. Some are older, but if they're that old, then they're beyond their lifespan anyway, right?
Potentially. That's why we're saying that we don't think any of the roofs can last more than 10 years
Okay.
with the maintenance. So some will last 7, some will last 5, some will last 3. Some, we should probably be out there doing it now. So it really is a sliding scale based on what's going on up there and how long they've been installed, and also what kind of material.
Okay.
Material matters. Most people, roofs aren't the nicest thing in the world, like, let's be honest. Most people don't ever go up on them. You don't get to use them like a nice room like this. You don't get to use it for anything else. It just keeps you dry. But if you're not keeping it maintained, then it affects rooms like this. So it's hard to spend the money on it. It's hard to want to put the maintenance and time into it, but it really makes a big difference long term, and it can save considerable amounts of money.
And one thing to add to that is, with the 3-tab shingles, and, they're not as good of a material, so they tend to deteriorate faster as they get to the end of their life. So if the 3-tab shingles have been on there for 20 years, then they're nearing the end of their life, they're going to start to deteriorate faster. Same thing with the membranes that have been on there for 20 years. The UV exposed things are going to start to deteriorate at a faster rate as they get older.
So I just had another question. So it's clear preventative maintenance is important. Seems like that's the single best way to protect the investment that we put in.
Yep.
I don't believe we have the ability to maintain the roofs with this current staff that we have. I mean, we have hard enough time filling positions. So is that something that that we could outsource to an organization like you guys? And is that a service that you guys offer as well, so that after this year, if we were to invest, you guys come back out yearly or semi-annual, or I don't even know, on some sort of schedule?
Yep, so that's kind of what we do. So we do a couple of different things. Harvard Medical, they kind of have the budget to do whatever the heck they want, so we do it a lot more often there, but we do stuff for like the city of Chelmsford, Massachusetts, where they're on a rotating schedule, because not every roof needs to be looked at every year. Sometimes just the older roofs need to be looked at more often, and sometimes the newer roofs get kind of put on the back burner, and so many years out, that's when we start incorporating them into our plan. But we do have a roof maintenance asset management plan that we do for a lot of different companies and municipalities. So that's kind of what we do. We don't actually do the work. So like, we're not up there trying to find punctures so that way you guys can pay us to go fix the puncture. That kind of doesn't, it's not a great model, because then, you know, we're trying to create work for ourselves. So that's why we like to be completely independent from the work being done. We do go and verify that the work has been done and done correctly and completely, so that way you guys know that you're actually getting what you're paying for. So not only do we do the initial inspections like what this report is, but we'll go back after we've hired the roofer, after they've said that they're complete, so that way we can see that, okay, this hole that was there, they actually did fix it. So that way you know that you're basically starting from scratch. You're starting from ground zero. So everything gets kind of cataloged, and then we have a whole dashboard system that we can share with facilities here that actually shows them, once we've gone through everything and it's done, it actually goes on their dashboard that it's been completed. So that way they get notifications when things are done and done correctly to go forward and compensate the roofing contractor for it. So it turns into kind of a seamless system, and we help take a lot of the burden off of the facilities team for roofing. We don't do masonry or siding or just roofing.
Pleasure.
Does anyone else have any questions for the roofing contractors? Or Jeremy, do you have anything else you want to add about the roofs?
No, I guess if we did decide to do a new roof somewhere as well, they would also assist us in that with the design and, right, and the RFP process and that sort of thing.
Yep, so if you...
Inspection along the way as the job is being done.
Yep, if you did decide to move forward with a roof and we were lucky enough to be asked to design it, we would actually do all the plans and specs. We don't do a manufacturer's canned spec. We don't use manufacturer's details. We actually go up and cut the roof open, see what you have there, so that way the roofer is actually seeing what they're bidding on before they get there. So you have very small chance of change orders. You have a very small chance of getting caught with something not being correct. Our specifications, we spec out down to the screws that they're supposed to use. We try to be very specific, because that way you get apples to apples, and you can really see who is kind of the best for the job. And then once that is completed, we put it out to bid with the help of your facilities department. If there's a specific roofing contractor that you prefer, we invite them and get some other competing contractors, so that way you're getting kind of apples to apples with contractors that are all in the same space, contractors that are all qualified to do the work. Because that's another big thing with roofing contractors. The guy that's putting shingles on your house thinks he can roof the school. It's not the same at all. So you need to make sure that you're getting the right people for the job. And we do construction oversight at increments during the process to make sure that you're getting the flashings that you paid for, they're using the right thicknesses of insulation, we're meeting code requirements. We do all that at the beginning. So they're bidding on the code requirements that they're supposed to be. If you have any insurance requirements, because sometimes schools do, that they have to meet in order to kind of satisfy what you guys have going on, we make sure that that's in there as well. So everything goes in and on in the correct way.
Well, we really appreciate the report, and we look forward to getting the more detailed report with the numbers. I think it'll be hugely helpful for us for planning.
Perfect.
And we thank you for your time tonight and apologize for the delay.
No problem. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Head out.
So if anyone else has anything else just to discuss about roofs, we could do that, but given that we don't have the information yet on cost, that may be hard to do. But Jeremy has pulled together a presentation that shows both the different things that are needed and where the funding would come from. And then Gordon is also here to help us understand warrant articles and what kind of things we could put out if we chose to do repairs. Why don't you go first, Jeremy, and go through your, what's needed and then how it could be funded, and then Gordon can explain our options and people can ask him any questions about that.
Okay. First one, I suppose, is Grinnell. Is this thing on? It's green. So, last time we had this meeting, I went through and just kind of went with all the different paragraphs that they had put in there for each individual item in the schools, and picked everything that had a 1 next to it, and figured if we were going to go to a plan B, C, or D, or whatever, we would kind of focus on the worst ticketed items. And as I read the report for the 10th time, I was kind of realizing that some of the things that were in here were, you know, they called them conditions. So if you had a boiler with, 10 expensive moving parts on it, you'd have one that's new, one that's 5 years old, plenty of life expectancy left, and then it would have parts on it that were past its life expectancy. Because of that, the whole system could fail, so this became a condition of 1. That's probably something we could do throughout the regular budget year. They're not, big ticket items like maybe a whole boiler. Maybe it's just replacing a pump or whatever, which we've never really done as far as preventative maintenance. We've done kind of like break-fix maintenance, and if they hadn't broken, then whatever. But, if they're 30-year-old pumps, using the master plan, some of those things I could do within the budget year. So we kind of just put these in, picking a year and thinking about what we could do for ESSER funds. 22, 23, that's obviously this year's budget. That's going to be a shorter list because we're not going to be able to find, 3 people to bid on something, come up with the information needed to go out to bid, that sort of thing. So we're still waiting on the door hardware company to schedule with me to go through and do the assessment throughout the district. So that's kind of throughout all these slides, that's in every single year. We're not sure exactly what that cost would be yet, but, some of them, exterior doors, could be ESSER funds. Making the way down the list, anything that was HVAC related, we put under the ESSER funding, which has to be done by the end of 23-24, September of 23, or September of 24?
September of '24.
Yeah. So we're going to be meeting with engineers, and I guess we can take that master plan and really kind of dig into everything that has the red under it and see what that comes out to and see what's left for ESSER funding money. And we would really need to get the ball rolling on that because some of those units are 2 years out. So we need to make a decision on that and start moving forward with it one way or the other. Like I said, it's just we kind of went through and plugged them into the years, kind of seeing what we would have for time. The list is kind of fluid, I guess, where we may end up moving something here and there depending on what the actual problem is when we dig into the units or dig into whatever's wrong. Still on Grinnell, for example, the indoor HV units, those are in the ceilings in that building, and they don't make parts for them. There's no model numbers on them. There's nothing. We've had to go and have parts actually machined to get those units to stay working. So some of the stuff's a no-brainer. Fire alarm, you'll see that throughout the whole thing. I mean, those are getting older. Those are something that we need to plan at some point. It's going to have to get replaced. Flooring, I've got that on every year. And if my list is correct, I think we had it like within 5 years, we'd have almost all the carpet out of the district. That's planning on, about $100,000 a year. As we go forward, I think we might have skipped it last year, or whatever year, and it didn't get much money. I don't remember when that was, but. On to Gilbert H. Hood. Again, you'll see some of the same thing. We got that 51 section that we would do some air in, HVAC, package rooftop units, just a lot of old stuff in these buildings that, kind of like when we were talking about the roofs, I mean, it's still running, but we should have a plan to start replacing, especially if we have that ESSER funding. We have ductwork insulation on Gilbert H. Hood. I don't think that's something we can, it'd be pretty invasive, I guess. It's not something like tear ceilings down. I mean, they had it on their report. I stuck it in here because it was a 1. But it's been there a long time, the way it is. I don't know. It's their recommendations, I guess. The grease interceptors too, I don't think, we don't use the kitchens as much as the reports. It has their professional opinions on it, but it's not like we cook French fries in the calves, or, we're not using the grease traps probably like as they would be designed for that many kids or cooking that many meals. We don't use all that stuff, so it's on there as a 1, but again, this can get filtered through. West Running Brook, one of the big items there would be the sprinkler system. The dry sprinkler system in the attic here has been a thorn in our side for a couple years now, a thorn in the fire department side. We really need to revisit that and do some new design work on that or something. What do we get here? Same thing, various ductless AC units, doors. The roof repair replacement stuff on each page is going to be blank until we get that report. The hot water radiators and the heat exchangers are on a lot of them as well, as you'll see, but again, those might be parts and pieces, and those are things we could probably fit within this year's budget once we start digging into that, and that's kind of onesie-twosie things. Derry Village, and West Running Brook, actually, we get the structural investigation for the precast panels. Again, when they came around and they did the plan, they took a look at it. We have precast panels here that are pushing out between the first and second floor, and they're out inches. Derry Village, we have the sills that are falling apart. So somebody needs to be hired to really dig in, maybe take core samples, tear something apart, and kind of look at what the actual source is of these issues. Until then, we don't know what the cost for repair is, or mitigation, or, actually, seeing if there is a possible repair or whatever. So I figured by the time, doing the HVAC, getting on that right away is going to take up a lot of time. It doesn't leave much room for this year for other work. And then that puts us right into 23, 24. So if we can kind of arrange to have somebody here to take a look at that stuff and kind of do like the roofers did and give us a report on what they think that might be. It could be short money. It could be a major deal. I'm not sure. Barca, pretty much the same stuff. We just kind of placed it in the following years and thinking about how long we can get away with what we have, as long as we knew it was coming in the near future. Again, they got the grease interceptor. The boilers are getting older. You'll see in the report that they say the boilers appear to be in great condition. I guess we can kind of live with that to an extent. But just like when I first started here in Derry Village, that boiler appeared to be in great condition, and then we lost a section of the boiler and we had no heat in the middle of winter. Over to East Derry. not in bad shape. The hot water heat exchanger is a thorn in our side for sure. Fire alarm system is older, not addressable. Like if we go there and we have a fire alarm, it will tell us it's in zone A. You know, whereas opposed if you go to Hood, it'll tell you it's in the 6th grade hallway, 2nd floor. They're just old systems and, you know, tough to find parts for, tough to repair. Electrical distribution, that was at a couple of the schools, including South Range and Derry Village. As far as circuitry, you know, you might have one circuit that feeds 2 or 3 classrooms, and I know in a lot of classrooms there's 2 outlets. So, you know, there's 10 surge protectors plugged in for their computers and stuff like that. So that's pushed out just to try and see what the options would be to add to that. But that would be a major project at each school. South Range. Oh, and not that you have to flick back to Derry Village, but the sewage ejector pumps in the kitchen. It's on there as a priority 1, but I don't see what we would do to fix that. I think that's just something we're gonna have to live with. Otherwise, we'd be pulling up the cement throughout the whole school, which that really isn't feasible. So, South Range, same thing. Pumps and radiators. Gym air handler has been abandoned in place. Mini splits, everything we have for mini splits is original to the invention of mini splits, it seems. Bathroom vent systems, that's an issue in a lot of areas. It just kind of gets neglected. Combustion air intakes, that's in the boiler rooms for fresh air or combustion air. Flooring again, that one also would need that structural investigation and the precast panels with the mortar going around the building. Pipe insulation, that was a priority 1 in this for some of the schools, but again, I don't think that's something that we would, you know, you might have an elbow that needs some here and there, but it's not a major project to do. That said, I think the next big step is the figuring out what can we do for ESSER funding before we run out of time. I think that'll be our main focus for a while. Again, we don't know what we're doing at Derry Village and South Range, but I think we would include that. You know, I would take all this red and run with it. Maybe have an itemized list, see what it comes out to.
Can I ask a question related to the kitchen sewer thing and a couple other things you mentioned? You mentioned that some things they listed were priority 1s, but that basically it was hard to get to it or you didn't know what you could do. So what was the reasoning for them being listed as a priority 1, and how concerned should we be that they were listed as a top concern, but we're saying, you know, it's 2 or 3 years or 4 years or more till we'll get to them?
Yeah, so more so with the HVAC, and these are like the big ticket items that for us in maintenance we're always dealing with. You know, some of the other ones we can start picking away at, like maybe on the original La Valley section, they broke everything down to certain priorities. When you got into the mechanical side and the electrical side, they broke it down into condition. They might have thrown priority in there here and there, but a lot of it was condition. So like I said, it could be a whole system that produces heat, 2 sections of it that without it we would not get any heat, but they're not very expensive parts as opposed to, you know, a $100,000 boiler or a $3,000 pump. The pump is old. If that pump goes, you have no heat. This is a condition 1. So it wasn't a priority, more of a condition. So as I read through them and I kind of like broke it all down, I'm like, okay, it's making more sense now that this condition here is not good. You have to fix this. But this part is in good shape, this part's in good shape, but this part is not. So I'd have to go through every single thing and break them down in that manner.
I also see a lot of red on this list that you're putting under ESSER. How much actual ESSER funding could we even access? I mean, how much do we even have left to access?
Well, what we put on there for red right now is more of an assumption on our part. We're like, okay, yeah, we think that can be on ESSER, so I guess maybe we would write a grant and then see, and they'd be like, no, that doesn't go on ESSER. Then we come back here and say we were wrong. But every single thing needs a grant written, right? Every red box that's there might need more than one. Who knows?
So, and that's why I also handed out this attachment, so if you, I've given this out before, but just for information on the last page, it shows the various things that ESSER 3 will cover. They will cover school facility repairs and improvements to enable operation of schools to reduce risk of virus transmission and exposure to environmental health hazards and support student health needs. It will pay for inspecting, testing, maintaining, repairing, replacing, and upgrading projects to improve indoor air quality in school facilities, including HVAC systems, filtering, purification and other air cleaning, fans, control systems, window and door repairs, and also development of strategies for a healthy facility. So right now, when we look at all of the areas that we put down there, they all tie to your air quality and having good air in your building. So right now, there's still a substantial amount of money left in ESSER funds, but that's also, I've only included, we have several positions that are in our ESSER grants right now that I've only put in year one of those. And I think that the board, you know, at some point going into spring should have those departments come back and give an assessment on, or some evidence-based reasoning to continue positions through a second year in ESSER. And based on those, you'll have more or less funding. You do have to have a certain percent for unfinished learning. But projections would be, I would say, the $4 to $5 million range. I would plan on closer to the 4 just to stay on the safe side. And that's what we're looking at right now. And when Jeremy and I worked through these lists, we were also very aware of not being heavy on any particular year, particularly for budgeting. When we were looking at fire alarms, we thought, do we put all fire alarms on 1 year so that you can go out to bid and have a better rate to do them all at once? We did not want to have a lot of projects in any one given year, and so that's why we tried to spread them out. And like he said, some of them can be done this current year. They're an easy fix for him to do. And right now, the way that we look at those areas for ESSER projects, and if we were going to move forward with them, I would probably send a list prior to writing the grant. The staff at Department of Ed have been really helpful when we've had a question on what would be allowable and what's not allowable. We would get verification on those prior to even going out to bid on that, just to make sure.
So we clearly have a long list of things that need to be done, and obviously how we fund those is one of the key questions. So I didn't know if people would be okay if we invited Gordon up now to talk about the different funding mechanisms. People can ask any questions of him they'd like, since he's been very patient, and then we can talk amongst ourselves about what that would look like in terms of what was put into those buckets. But I think it would be helpful to know what our options are.
So Attorney Gordon Graham was gracious enough to come and join us this evening. He gave us, there's 8 different options for warrant articles that could be used for any type of a maintenance building project that we may have in mind, and one of these warrant articles will be applicable to a project that you might have. So I think Gordon's going to address the 8 different options, and that might help you think about what would work for some of the things that we're proposing.
Yeah, and let me explain what I did. When you say 8 options, they're not 8 options for specific projects. They're just styles of warrant articles for your consideration. And they rely on different mechanisms for districts to raise money and to hold on to money. So one of the things that Derry has not done a lot of is create capital reserve funds. And many districts have major capital reserve funds that they have established and fund on a yearly basis for a variety of purposes. And capital reserve funds are, as you may know, basically a district savings account. And so what I thought I'd do was give you some, orally, just give you some examples of districts. You know, Londonderry to right next door has multiple capital reserve funds. They have a technology capital reserve fund, they have a building and grounds capital reserve fund, they have a field maintenance capital reserve fund, they have an equipment capital reserve fund, they have a vehicle capital reserve fund, and every year in every single at every single district meeting, a substantial sum of money gets appropriated to each of those funds. And those funds are then held in that capital reserve fund as a savings account and expended for the purposes that year of maintaining whatever they want to do. This is similar, for example, to the way the town of Salem funds its road improvement plan. So every year, the town of Salem puts on its warrant an article to appropriate a large sum of money for its road maintenance program. All that money goes into a capital reserve fund. They usually list each year the roads that they're planning on doing. These are what we're planning on doing with this, and it's in the background material that's given to voters to say we're not just salting money away for a project in the future, but we're actually going to be putting money in and taking money out of this fund to fund our capital improvement needs. I'll just say that's what you've got here, the makings of what Jeremy's done in terms of laying out over a 5-year period a whole bunch of stuff that needs to get done. There are districts, Wyndham, for example, and Raymond, for example, are two examples, where they have a capital improvement plan that they absolutely devote themselves to following. And they establish the amount of money that needs to go into maintenance of all their building facilities on a yearly basis. And that then gets projected out over a period of years, and that capital improvement plan gets supported by the board, and the board then says, these are the things that are in our capital improvement plan that need to go forward, and every year they have an appropriation that goes into their capital reserve funds of the amount that the capital improvement plan needs in order to accomplish the goals that are necessary in order to do that. Some of the advantages of a capital reserve fund are that all the appropriations that go into the fund don't lapse. And as a result of that, they stay in that savings account. So it's not an appropriation for 1 year, it's an appropriation until that money is expended. The other advantage of the capital reserve funds is that for the voters, the money can only be spent for the purposes that it's appropriated for. So it's not like it can be transferred to something else, and they know that the money's going to go to maintenance of the facilities and to improvements of the facilities if that's what you choose to do. The best advantage of it is if there's enough money in the capital reserve fund, it gives the district a tremendous amount more flexibility to address issues that come up during the course of the year that you didn't anticipate. Every capital improvement plan, no matter how good it is no good once the pump breaks in the boiler or the boiler fritzes out, even though you didn't anticipate that it was going to. Something happens. Or the roof that you've been trying to repair ends up having a catastrophic failure because of a storm, because of whatever the case may be. And you're caught without any resources to be able to address that. Not so if you've got a capital reserve fund, because you've got the money that's sitting there in your savings account that's for that purpose. And without having to go to a district meeting, without having to go back to voters, without asking for more money, you can end up being able to withdraw money from that capital reserve fund and expend it for that purpose without an additional meeting. So those are a lot of advantages. So I put together a sample capital reserve fund. And the purpose of that capital reserve fund can be written as broadly or as narrowly as you want it to be. There are capital reserve funds for very specific purposes. I don't recommend that because they're of limited utility. At one point years ago, I'll give you an example, our friends in Raymond had specific capital reserve funds for every piece of equipment in their kitchen. And they were separate for each piece of equipment. It was crazy. They ended up, and one of the reasons why they did that was because they were trying to demonstrate to voters how deplorable the conditions were in the kitchen, and they needed a much larger bond to be able to pay for those improvements. And they got the bond and they fixed the kitchen. And then they dissolved all those funds and put them into something else. So, my point is that they can be too specific, I think. So better to keep them very broad. Then the question becomes, how do you fund them? Out of what what money do you put in them? Is it an additional appropriation? Or is it money that was already appropriated that was going to lapse to surplus, right? And you have that choice. You can do either or both. Or you can use whatever else, other funding that may be available. You can designate a particular, for example, districts that have a lot of property, wouldn't that be great, and sell some of their property, can designate the proceeds from the sale to go to a capital reserve fund. You can put all sorts of different sources of revenue into a capital reserve fund, and you can designate it that way. The typical choice, however, is unassigned fund balance at the end of the year, and by the voters approving an appropriation from fund balance at the end of the year, you actually have designated where that fund balance is going to go. So it's no longer undesignated fund balance. It's now designated. It goes to a capital reserve fund. And the other obvious option is to fund it through a straight appropriation to that capital reserve fund through additional taxation. Now, one of the things is that there have been discussions over the years about districts that have now adopted the ability to retain unassigned fund balance. And yeah, you can retain unassigned fund balance, but that fund balance is largely largely used to smooth out the tax rate over the course of years based on fluctuations in adequacy money and all the other fluctuations, and keeping an eye on that. But think about this. When you have a fund balance that you've accumulated and you operate your year without running into a deficit, you know you're going to have a fund balance at the end of the next year. So if you appropriate money from fund balance to go into a capital reserve fund to then hold on to for the purposes of maintenance, you know you're going to have money going into the capital reserve fund because you have an accumulated fund balance, and unless disaster strikes and you decide to appropriate money from that fund balance, you're going to end the year with a fund balance. And Derry typically runs with a little bit of a margin to be able to get to the next year. You have to keep an eye on how much money goes back to reduce taxes in the following year, and that's a calculation that only the wizard knows, but because she's really good at it. But anyway, so capital reserve fund. That's the first article that I've done, put forth for you. And what I did was show you an article that both raised and appropriated the sum to be placed in the fund from the June 30 fund balance, but also money that would be put in the fund from general taxation. So that's a combined article. And you can choose either one of those and I just gave you a sample on the option 2, where the sample shows it just coming from a straight appropriation to be placed in the fund. Then I gave you a sample article in number 3 about what an article would look like in the future. That's an article that would be after the Capital Reserve Fund was created. In future years, there would be an annual appropriation to the Capital Reserve Fund to continue funding the needs of the district to tackle all the things that you're talking about doing here. So those are one set of options, all the Capital Reserve Fund type articles. Capital Reserve funds are held by the trustees of the trust fund of the town. If the school board is named as agents to expend the fund, they have the authority to call on the trustees to release the money from the trustees, from the trust funds that are held by the town, and have them sent to the district for the purposes of the expenditure in accordance with the purposes of the Capital Reserve Fund. Let's see. That's one of the other things that I mentioned as a benefit. Over the years, there have been a series of state grants. When the state ends up being flush in a particular year, sometimes they will create a matching fund. They did that a few years ago for security upgrades, and the district needed to match those funds with a 20% grant, and the state would pay 80%. Well, if you've got a capital reserve fund for the same purpose as the state's grant purpose, you now have matching funds, so you have the ability to accept that grant money and expend that grant money. Without that authority, without having a source of revenue to cover the matching funds in a grant, you may not be able to accept it, because the limitations on the ability to accept grants is that you can only accept grants if it doesn't necessitate the expenditure of money that is appropriated for that purpose, which is why ESSER is such a great set of grants, because there are no strings like that attached to it. So, all of that said, those are the capital reserve funds. Now, the second set of articles is really straight appropriations, and they're straight appropriations for roof maintenance. And again, you can choose where that straight appropriation comes from, and you can choose whether or not you wish to designate that straight appropriation as a special warrant article, or whether it would be just plain separate warrant article. The advantage of a special warrant article is that the special warrant article could be encumbered for one additional year if the project had not been completed or had not been bid out by the end of the fiscal year. The school board could vote to encumber that money for one additional year. The other advantage or disadvantage of a special warrant article is that the money that's appropriated under an article designated as special can only be spent for the purposes of that article. And I've given you a number of examples of that. Separate and special warrant articles can again be funded by either taxation, or they can be funded by money from surplus if you choose to do that. So those are the options. I'll be happy to try and answer any questions that you have. There's a broad, there are many ways in which you can word and establish the purpose of a capital reserve fund. Normally the reserve funds are named, and then there's a very broad statement of the purpose, so you have the maximum flexibility for using that fund into the future to be able to accomplish your goals. We typically recommend that districts that have a series of capital reserve funds for things that are unexpected expenses. Everything from educating students with special needs to districts that pay tuition to an out-of-district school or an in-district school, such as Derry, to cover tuition expenses in the event that there was a huge influx of students that into the community. For high school, you might be short of your tuition amount, and we typically recommend that districts have a number of capital reserve funds to cover the eventuality that that something might happen, either that's unexpected, that costs a district money.
So Gordon, I have two things for clarification, because I believe we're going to bring it back on September 6th to the board regarding retained funds. So I generated options of retained funds anywhere from don't retain any to 25% of the allocation, because we can retain up to 5% of the net assessment. Anywhere from don't retain any to retain the full 5%. So, for example, if the board were to retain the full 5%, that amount would carry through the 22-23 year, and
Unless it was spent.
And then at the end of June 30th, the
Yep.
22-23 year is complete. That then becomes part of the unreserved fund balance.
Yep.
And if we had written a warrant article specifically that you were going to have a capital reserve account reserving 500,000 of unreserved funds, that's where that money would come from, because that all goes now added to the unreserved.
Plus anything that was an additional fund
Yes.
balance that was available as a result of under expenditures of your appropriations that have been approved from the current fiscal year, or additional revenue that have been received. So it continues, and then there'd be a new calculation about what the unreserved fund balance would be going forward.
Okay, and so if warrant articles, if we're working through a budget process now for
Yep.
the 23-24 year,
Yep.
any warrant article that we draft now that says we would use the unreserved, make a capital reserve account from unreserved funds, would it be coming from the 22-23 unreserved funds?
It's all one thing after the end of in June 30th of 2023, right?
Yep.
When this fiscal year ends, whatever unreserved fund balance you have retained under the contingency article that had been previously done, plus any year-end fund balance from this fiscal year, will be unreserved fund balance unless it's assigned to a particular location.
So for, because there were no warrant articles for this fiscal year,
Yep.
the warrant articles that we would be drafting would actually come from the unreserved fund balance from the 23-24. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure
Yeah,
that.
that's fair to say.
Okay. I just want to make sure
But you
everybody's.
get confused about years.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
I mean,
I'm always in 3 of them, so.
Yeah,
I'm
right,
always-
you're always in 3 of them, but the bottom line is that it gets, the thing to think about is that the fund balance that you can retain gets determined annually, and it can't be more than 5% of the total net assessment of the district, which is the total amount that's assessed for local taxes plus the total amount that comes from SWEPT, all right? So,
Gordon.
I know that's a lot of stuff.
Confusing, but, so, from what I heard, there's 3 sources, but kind of only 2. So, obviously, just through the budget appropriation from the budget, so additional tax dollars that they would vote on in March to say, yes, you can take $200,000 and put it into this fund this year, or from unreserved,
Yep.
or from year-end surplus, which would go into retained funds the following year if we didn't put it into a capital reserve fund.
But those are the same thing.
Right, but
Right.
to us, I see it as 3 different things. But
Okay.
So if we had a warrant this coming March, and that said we could use year-end surplus, we could still open a fund next year with anything that was left over from this fiscal year's funds.
Right.
Okay.
But what's left over from this fiscal year's funds, the point I'm making, is your fund balance that you're carrying as a result of the decision you're going to make in a couple of weeks, plus whatever you don't expend and any additional revenue that you have from fiscal year 2023.
But don't we have to give back what we didn't use this year?
That's why that'll be fund balance that goes back to either reduce taxes or that you choose to retain up to 5% of the district's net assessment next year.
So you could use
It's the same thing.
this year's unreserved account to start a fund in June of '23.
Well, yeah, I mean,
So say-
however it's
say-
easier for you to think about it.
Say we reserve the full 5%.
Yep.
When it gets brought back. So at the end of next year, June 30th, we have 5%. And say we also have $500,000 of surplus for this year. We have to give back whatever we voted on to keep last year to taxpayers, don't we?
No,
We don't.
no. You didn't vote to give anything back to taxpayers.
But we
You're not going to
voted-
vote to give anything back to taxpayers until Jane comes in in a couple of weeks, you said, right? With
That's what I'm saying, though. Last year, though, when we said we're going to retain, I think we said 5% last year, didn't we? Or did we do 2.5 last year? We did the full 5 last year. So doesn't that 5 have to go back if we don't keep it?
No, whatever this year in September, you're going to decide how much you're going to retain going forward for the 2023 fiscal year.
Right.
You're going to decide that. And some amount is going to go back to taxpayers. I mean, you've anticipated for years a large revenue that goes back to taxpayers to reduce taxes. You're not going to retain all of that. You're going to make sure that there's something there to cover that source of revenue so the taxes don't go up. That's why you're deciding how much you want to retain.
Okay.
But that amount that you end up deciding to retain, that you're able to retain under the contingency article, will be available at the end of fiscal year 2023, so long as you do not spend it. You
Okay.
could spend it by holding a public hearing and requesting permission to expend that money, or not requesting permission, you have the authority to expend that money. But, you know, it will be there so long as you don't expend that sum of money, and so long as fiscal year 2023 ends in the black.
Right.
If it ends in the red, it's going to be swallowed up covering the red, right? So if all of a sudden revenues caved and expenses increased, or you spent to the bottom line of the budget, and your revenues didn't show up, you could end the year in the red. Well, that's where the fund balance comes in to cover that.
Okay.
Won't happen. You've never done that, ever. You know, it won't end in the red, but you know, you'll end in the black. So there'll be more to be added on to what you will retain this year, and that will be fund balance at the end of next year. And you go through the whole exercise again of deciding how much of that you're going to
Right.
retain.
So we could vote on a warrant in March
Yeah,
and
that's the point.
use the funds to start this capital reserve plan for next,
Yes.
for
and
over the summer even. I mean, it would, whenever you get the funds, then you could,
I would anticipate that, and Jane can, that you will have a substantial, you know, an ability to create a fund with a substantial down payment in it.
yep, all right.
Right, so I think that's where the confusion was, and I think people want to be clear on, because they don't have a warrant article now, the warrant article that's written in March, or voted on in March, applies to this fiscal year's year-end balance. So in June, we couldn't just open up a capital reserve account because we didn't vote on one.
We can't do one now.
Correct.
No, we
Right.
can't, we
So-
cannot create a capital reserve. The only way to put money into a capital reserve fund is through a warrant article and a warrant.
Yeah.
You know, you have to have a warrant article and a warrant creating the fund, and you have to have you have to have that a warrant article approved. Yeah.
So if I hear you correctly, you're basically saying in June 2023, July 1st, 2023, anything that's left over that we didn't spend or we retained, if we had a warrant article saying we wanted to put it in a capital reserve fund and that article passed, we could put any of that money in that account?
Correct.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that.
Yep. Yep.
Is that a 60% vote with the town?
Excuse me, 50%. Yeah.
It's 50?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And as I said, I mean, you know, for example, last year, I brought them, I was going to read some of them to you, but, you know, Londonderry put in $680,000 to their capital reserve fund, and, you know, Wyndham put in, you know, Raymond put in $650,000, and, you know, it's a large money to maintain these buildings, you know, and you've done that in your budget, you know, it's in your budget. The maintenance is a specific line in your budget, but you know, by creating the capital reserve fund, you pull some of that out of the budget, and there'll be things that stay in the budget, but you can then better keep an eye on and better be able to plan for addressing all of these things that are in these reports, because you've got a lot of things that need to be juggled. You know, you got a lot of things up in the air, and so.
And Gordon, by retaining the 5%,
Yes.
that obviously leaves us with more of a surplus at the end of June 30th.
Yes.
And more more money in order to have those capital reserve accounts, as opposed to if we went with not retaining any of the 5% or retaining 25%
Yep.
of the 5%. By retaining the full 5%, that gives us a more financial, stronger ability to have more to put towards capital reserves.
No question about it. No question about it. But you know, balanced off with the need to make certain that you're keeping an eye on that tax rate, you know, and making, you know, and however you choose to do that. But I mean, it basically gives you the ability to set the tax rate, you know, really does. Gives you a lot of flexibility by choosing how much you want to return to reduce taxes. And you keep it stable and then keep a good amount in that fund balance. You've got lots to put away if you run the books well again that year, the following year, and you keep doing that.
And you would have to have another warrant, like you have on here, to put in additional funds each and every year after?
Yes, yeah, yeah. And again, it's the same analysis, it's just a shorter article.
Right.
It's the same analysis every year if you're doing it from surplus. It's just a shorter article because all you do is name the article. You don't have to have all the other words to make everybody's eyes bleed.
Thank you.
Does
that help?
does anyone else have any other questions for Gordon?
I don't know if this is a question for Gordon or for us, but I mean, this sounds great. Like, it sounds like it's something we should be doing, as far as having a capital reserve fund and having the ability to expend money when we need to. My question is like, how do we make sure we're kind of balancing the right plates, right? Like, we're talking about, thinking about putting a warrant on for a new school, and then if we were to put a capital reserve fund warrant up there, like, how much more difficult is that going to be to pass, right? And then all the same time, like, the maintenance in our buildings, which need repairs, are being put on hold and waiting. I know Gordon mentioned a special meeting. I think that's something else that we might want to consider towards the end of this year, the beginning of next calendar year, as far as figuring out like a solution for roofs Because if we are tracking towards another $2 to $3 to $4 million surplus, I think that's something where we need to say, hey, we have money that we can spend, and say we need to put these into the roofs. I think that's, so again, not a question for you, Gordon, but just kind of thoughts that I think we all need to consider.
Just so I understand, John, are you saying have a special meeting to spend some of the retained funds? I guess I'm unclear on what you're saying.
Yeah, I'm just saying, we got a lot of irons in the fire right now. I mean, being very blunt, I don't think there's any way we pass a new school building being built and a capital reserve fund. Like, I just, again, there's a reason the taxpayers have not voted for a capital reserve fund in Derry for quite some time. So I think that's something we have to consider as well, is we have to be balancing all of these.
To clarify, we've only done 2 capital reserve accounts in my 22 years, and both capital reserves passed. One has been fully expended, and we do still have one capital reserve account that is being held by the trustees of the trust fund at the town. So I actually don't manage the account. It's not managed, I mean, it's not held through the school district. But that one is still available for us to use, and I think there might be it's in the $190,000 range for maintenance.
Yeah, so I think that's maybe more to my point, like the amount of money, like, we don't need hundreds of thousands of dollars to fix the fixtures, roofs. We need millions of dollars, right? So I think that's kind of, there's got to be a reason we haven't had these large capital expenditure or capital reserve funds. I mean, if Londonderry has a bunch of them and they work, again, it seems like, again, it's just going to be hard to, I think, fund, even if we were to do something like that. I guess it just seems like we're kind of going in a lot of different directions, and we need to figure out which direction we're going in.
I'm happy to continue this discussion, but at this point, does anyone have any more questions for Gordon? If not, Gordon, thank you very much for the information and clarification and for your time. We really appreciate it. John, you can continue now. I just didn't want to hold up Gordon.
Again, we're talking about facilities. This is a facilities workshop. Like, we need to have a plan. Like, we've been, and I think we need to go full force towards that plan, right? So if we all believe, as we voted, that a new school is that, I think that's the first thing we need to tackle from a facilities. I think that's emergency number one. If that's changed, then I guess we need to figure out, like, again, if this is the plan that we're moving forward with is putting a warrant article on, and I'm not saying make that decision today, but I think we need to make these decisions sooner rather than later.
Before we go any further into that, Jeremy, I just had a quick question way back on your presentation. You had mentioned that some units, and I'm guessing it's HVAC units, are a couple years out for production. Is that?
Yeah, I guess it's like everything else.
Okay. So, and we have until the end of September 2024 for ESSER funds. So can we get, at least for one of the September meetings, some information on which units are going to take that long to order, and if we probably need to vote on them and get them in the works?
We're going to have a meeting next week, hopefully, and I can have more information on that.
On that same topic, is the September 2024 date when we have to have booked a project, or it has to actually be done and the money expended?
The money has to be expended by September 30th, I believe, of 2024.
Yeah, so I think on these big units, we need to move on that. And obviously, if we have to put an order in for 2 years, that's September 2024. So hopefully, during that time, they catch up on production and we get it sooner to get the project done. But we have to make that vote very, very soon.
Yeah, we're meeting with Jim Lucy from Honeywell next week.
Excellent.
And his team.
Jane, did you want to, at this point, does anyone else have any questions for Jeremy about anything he's presented before Jane gives an update on school building aid? If not, I will pass the floor to Jane, and we can go back to any of the other
Gordon.
topics after. Thank you, Gordon.
Okay. So, last week, we met with the state, and that was part of the proposed new school building process, where they come out and you take them in toward your school and give an assessment of the conditions of the building and justifications for why you're requesting school building aid and funding. And that's where we spoke with Amy Clark, and she brought to our attention, with the calculations for school building aid, that because both Derry Village and South Range had work done on each of those buildings that is less than 35 years old, I think each of those projects were 2001, that the amount of square footage for both of those projects, which combined, they were 35,360 square feet of addition and renovation, that would be reduced off your allowable amount for school building aid, because the project is not older than 35 years. So this is going to be I tried to make it as simple as possible, the calculation, because I probably could have done 4 pages of how to explain this. So I'm going to try to do it very simply, for if everybody could just try to follow along with my math that I'm working on here, that I worked out with Amy Clark, and Jeremy was with me earlier today. The new building project, our proposal shows 820 students. The state will only pay for 120 square feet per student when it's an elementary school and you have more than 250 students. So maximum amount allowable is 120 per square feet, which comes to a total of 98,400 square feet allowable. You then have to subtract out the amount that Derry Village and South Range had for their addition and the amount of square feet that they had in their project that was done in 2001. So you would take the 98,400, subtract the Derry Village South Range addition that was done, which is 35,360 square feet. That leaves us 62,040 square feet that would be eligible for school building aid. In the school building application, it's actually page 5, it breaks down what the costs are for the proposed new school building. That net cost is $65,293,567. That's the cost for the new space, which is for construction, furniture, fixtures, equipment, the permits needed for the project, and the contingency fund that would be in the project. You would then divide that by 130,000 square feet, which is what our proposed project is. You would then, once you divide those two, the cost of the building and the square footage of the building, that comes out to $502.26 per square foot cost. So if you remember, if we went up to the top line again, there was 62,000 that was eligible square feet. So I'm going to take that calculation, 62,000 of eligible square feet. That comes to $31,160,210. And then you add the site acquisition costs. Jeremy's laughing because we went through this to see if we could make it as simple as possible. The site acquisition cost for the new project comes to $40,837,210 of your eligible project cost. So now take that figure, the $40,837,000, multiply it by the Derry School District's school building aid rate, which is 45%, which is what we received on the Gilbert H Hood renovation and the new build at Barca. So multiply that by 45%, comes to $18,300,000 $376,744, which is the allowable school building aid, which is, if all calculations are correct and numbers don't change, that's approximately what we would receive in school building aid on the new school building. Now, keep in mind, even though we had overlooked and weren't aware about the 35,000 square footage, that was not eligible because the project isn't over 35 years, our project still would have, had that not been in play, we still would have only received enough for 98,000 square feet. It would not, school building aid still would not have been calculated on our full building project. So these numbers certainly will shift a little bit, but instead of giving you just simple numbers that to follow along in the math, I wanted to use our actual project to give you an idea. So also when we did the walkthrough, there were about half of the projects that originally applied for school building aid that were thinking that they would have projects coming up have since removed their projects, which is positive for Derry. But it is a bit of a calculation. It's a pretty complicated calculation, but I try to make it as simple as possible so that you could see what the net actually would be. And again, I believe there's 10,000 square feet for deep that I didn't take off of here, but does anybody have any questions on that? Paul?
Just a clarification, that 18,376,000 and so on, that's the maximum. They could give us less if they were to grant, if we were to make the criteria and they gave us a grant. It doesn't necessarily mean that's as much as we would get. We could get less, right?
You could get less based on available funding. That would be the max.
That's the max.
If all these numbers were true.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And Jane, what is the max that they have to disperse?
Well, I think originally the pool was in the $100 million range, and Jessica, Jeremy were there, Paul, Jonathan. We believe that it was about $100 million, the original pool, but some of the projects that are carrying over from the prior fiscal year have some of that money allocated to them. So I think their estimate, what's available to these new projects coming up, is somewhere in the $45 million range of available funds. And, you know, we did find out the other day when we asked them about what projects people were, some people did apply for things that aren't allowable. They were applying for a roof, or they were applying for things that they weren't going to be able to get funding for. And those projects were removed, or, you know, the projects just haven't moved forward, so.
Jane, what is the site acquisition part of this?
So the site acquisition on the application, on page 5, would be the existing property. So the $65 million is for everything that would be new. The site acquisition costs are on the application, and that's for doing all the site work for the existing property.
And then you mentioned deep, because deep won't be eligible. So
correct, and I think that total cost is about 10,000 square feet. So I just didn't have time to try to pull the deep. I wasn't able to extract that out of here for the purpose of this meeting, but
the 18 million is not correct. It'll be below that based on the deep square footage.
Based on, like I said, yes. So this is without taking the deep out of it. It'd be a little bit less if we did the deep calculation.
Do we know why maybe LaValle didn't explain this to us the first go around, and you know, it's something that they would have found when they were looking through and say, well, you could choose these schools, but they've had additions within 35 years, and we've done this for so long with so many schools, we know you can't use that as eligible. Any particular reason we think La Valley would have told us that and not made us go back to the drawing board? Because I think that's where we're at. I think we're back to the drawing board. There's no way we're going to be able to get a school built for less than 18 million of state kick-in funds, so. Right. And with 45 million left in the pot, I doubt we get anywhere near that.
Right, so the piece that, we've known since the beginning is that school building aid is not going to cover the full cost of the project anyways, because it's only going to cover 120 square feet. So you're already down to the 98,400, and we're at 130,000 square feet. There are, when I spoke to Amy today, there are, you can apply for an exception, and unfortunately, the laws have not kept up with the costs that all of projects are coming out to. And when I spoke to her earlier today, she said most of the projects are 180 to 200 per square foot, and the state only allows 120 per square foot. She also talked about the increased space for special education that, again, school building aid has not kept up with the fact that all school districts have to have more space for special education. So we knew we were not going to get full school building aid on the building of the size that we were looking at. So the piece that we did not plan for was the 35,360 square feet. And so I'm not sure. I certainly don't want to say anything against La Valley Brensinger. It wasn't brought up, but it is on the website of School Building Aid, and quite honestly, I've gone through those pages myself a million times, and I did not catch it myself. So I'll certainly take the blame on that one. Another note on that, though, Derek, is school building aid also is not going to pay for a renovation that exceeds the cost or a percentage of having to do a new building. So if you were to do a renovation, you likely would not get school building aid on either, I would believe, Derry Village and South Range project based on the cost of renovations.
So you're saying we're kind of in a very difficult spot, because you're saying we probably couldn't get school building aid to repair South Range or Derry Village, but we also would get a very minimal amount considering the cost if we wanted to build new.
Right, well, it would depend on how much, I mean, if you pare down the amount of your project, or if you wanted to do an addition, but yes, I don't see how you would get that.
So this is the second of these meetings. Clearly, we need some more to figure out what is viable and what we want to bring forward to voters, because we want to bring forward something that we think has a likelihood of passing and has a likelihood of funding. I don't know, unfortunately, this is not good news, and it's very disappointing to me. I don't know what to make of it, but I think we need a plan moving forward to maybe look at what we think is viable to bring forward, and that will likely require scheduling more meetings, but that's it. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that, or where we're going to want to go next? So I think unfortunately, we're going to have trouble making a lot of solid things tonight because we don't have enough information on the cost of the roofs. It looks like we'll get a great report to really get a sense of that. But I think for our next meeting, we probably want to think about our thoughts on the capital reserve fund, and maybe those thoughts could be paired with when we look again at the retained funds next week. We could pair those two items and further that discussion. And then we should certainly set another meeting for facilities to talk about these new developments, very unfortunate new developments, and where we should go from here. Does anyone else have anything else they want to bring up tonight, or any thoughts on when that next facilities meeting should be?
Erica, just a quick question for Jeremy. I very much appreciate how you've gone back through that massive report and kind of figured out there's some things that maybe wouldn't cost as much and keep something out of category one by just replacing, a couple $20,000, $30,000 part or something rather than the full $1 million equipment. So obviously your costs your predicted costs may not align with their report. Is there a way that you can put together, at least for the next year and now obviously not including the roofs because we're still waiting on that, and obviously not including the in-depth inspections for the precast and all that stuff, but just things you may know, like, yeah, this is probably going to cost this much for the next year or two of chipping away at some of these pieces, just so we have somewhere to go at the next meeting when we meet, because otherwise we don't have anything that I feel is accurate anymore. Once we get the roof, that'd be great, and then if you have anything that you're going to say about the category ones that you can fix without blowing everything up.
Yeah, I can certainly do that.
Maybe that could be something not at our next September meeting, because obviously it's next week, but at the one after that.
I mean, for next facility meeting.
Oh, next facility meeting, okay. How much, do you have a sense of how much time, when for you would be a good time to schedule that next meeting?
Definitely need help with it, so it depends on schedules of, either engineers or contractors or, when they'd be available, but.
So if you want to look into that and then talk with Jane, and we can schedule that next meeting when you have the information you need in order to give us some further steps, because we definitely need to take them, but we need information behind us. And thank you very much for all of your work tonight. It was an excellent presentation. The roofing company was excellent as well. They were very helpful in providing information. Does anyone else have anything else for tonight?
The only thing I would ask is when we do schedule those meetings, and you obviously outline some of the things we talk about, which is great, but I would add that we should have some goals, what we want to decide on before we leave that meeting, whatever it could be. We just need to have some goals of what we want to move forward with. Because, budgets start in 3 weeks, then October comes up, and it's pretty, extensive after that. And then I guess the question I have to Jeremy and maybe Jane is, there's a lot of work for the ESSER funds, it looks like, out there. We have 2 years, right, to spend $4 million. Is that feasible? I guess we need to understand if that's feasible as well. And I think I would say that's a higher priority right now, because we need to understand if we can do these projects in 2 years. And we just need to factor that into our discussion. And the roofs are obviously a high priority, but the ESSER funds seem to be, we've only got 2 years left. And from the discussions we've had multiple times, it's, contractors issues, parts issues. 2 years seems like a long time, but it probably won't be.
No, it flies.
And spend $4 million in 2 years, that's a lot of money. And it takes time to do that. Obviously, you guys know that. So I would prioritize those discussions as well. Next meeting, wherever that we have that. I think we should have them sooner rather than later too, and really try to push through. Because remember, we need to talk to the public too about that. We need to get something in front of the public in the fall and winter before we can move on to March. So
based on yours, we might be able to have a facilities relatively soon, just based on ESSER, and then have another one later once Jeremy can put together some costs for a future maintenance plan type deal.
So I think it's an excellent idea to have some goals for the next meeting and to lay those out. I would suggest that maybe people think about that over the next week, and we do have, as usual, a facilities update on our agenda for next Tuesday. Maybe that would be a good topic for that discussion, and maybe we could start building that list during that agenda item next week. Or if people have ideas sooner, they could certainly email them to me or John. Does anyone else have anything else for tonight or any thoughts they want to leave? If not, I would just like to thank Jane for all her work pulling things together, and Jeremy for all his, and Jonathan for hustling to get us online so that our meeting could go forward. So thank you very much, Jonathan, and I would welcome a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
First by Derek, second by John. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you very much, everybody.